feedback session for forgetting exam questions, which you should have completed last week. I'd like to get your questions out and have a look at this and go against the mark scheme. This is probably the best way for me to give you feedback. This should probably have taken you about 48 to 50 minutes. So we'll start first of all with question 1. If you can get your questions out, again, please contact me if you're not sure about any of these. Usually with AQA, the lines that are provided for you try to give you a rough guidance as to how much you should be writing. So we're starting off first of all with an AO2 question. So Toby and Sarah studied AS psychology at the same school. Toby's class was taught in the school lecture theatre, while Sarah's class had lessons in a science classroom. Both students sat the final psychology exams in the school lecture theatre. Which student is likely to perform worse? Use your knowledge of the explanations to justify your answer. So, first of all, when you're answering something like this, you should have an idea, first of all, of the difference and the kind of area that we're talking about. And hopefully, you've already identified that we're talking about some kind of retrieval failure, and it's to do with the environment. So it's therefore context-dependent cues. So first of all, the first bit here for this is selecting the right information and selecting the right theories. So I would hope that first of all you would just think, first of all, well, Toby's class was taught in the same place in which he then recalled the information, so Toby's going to do better. Sarah's class was taught in a science classroom, and therefore when she comes to recall, she's recalling in a different environment. It should make you think of the divers study, where, if you remember, divers learn words underwater and recalled on land and so on. So, first of all, which student is likely to perform worse? The answer would be Toby. Yeah, Sarah is likely to perform worse. So, if you have a look here at the mark scheme, Sarah learnt and recalled in a different environment or different context. The cues that were present when learning the material would not have been present in the lecture theatre. Therefore, there was an absence of cues, and she did not have any triggers to aid her recall. And then this is the study here that we looked at, Godden and Badley, which was the diver study. If I can just highlight it there for you. And you could say this is supported by, and then bring that study in. Again, if we have a look, it's quite easy the way that it's marked. Just make sure that you give a clear and detailed one. If you write something like, Sarah's performance is worse because she learnt in a different classroom to where she was tested, that would be quite a limited explanation, because whilst it's accurate, you've not actually given any detail or backed it up with anything. So that's where, if you're not exactly sure, really, you think about the theory is of retrieval cues. So you need to bring something up there in that answer about the lack of retrieval cues. So you probably know why Sarah would have done worse, but you've got to actually explain it. This is because there was a lack of retrieval cues in the, the school lecture theatre. So, again, it must be linked to the STEM. You must be using the name Sarah in that. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. And sorry, I've got a problem with this. And this is Aaron. Aaron was upset as he left the Spanish exam in the unfamiliar room, full of nerves. His mind had gone completely blank. He was regretting studying both French and Spanish because he was sure he'd mixed up a lot of words. Okay, outline one explanation of forgetting. How might this explanation account for Aaron's poor performance in the Spanish exam? Now, this has been marked slightly differently to the previous one, because if we just go to the mark scheme, we've got some banding here, and that's because what they're actually looking at, I don't know why there's a discrepancy in the way that they're marked different, but again, we're going to be looking at probably the retrieval failure again. So it is marked the same, really. It's just that in terms of an examiner, you would want to sort of band it like this, because the way that we would do this is say, well, level 1 is if there is not really any application at all, if it's just some kind of knowledge. So The issue again is the lack of cues. So Aaron is not in the same context when he learnt the material for his Spanish exam, and he's therefore in an unfamiliar room. He's also not in the same physical emotional state. So we've actually got both types of retrieval failure here. You could talk about state dependent forgetting or context dependent forgetting. Both would fit there. Again, how do you not get into level 2 if you don't use the terminology? So if you just say something like, Aaron was learning in a completely different environment, and that's why I didn't remember, that would, if you like, that's not enough detail. You've got to actually say, therefore, this is context dependent forgetting, because he learnt in one context, i.e. in a particular classroom, and then he had to recall in an unfamiliar room. This is different because the cues wouldn't have been present. Again, Aaron, when he learnt in quite a stable state, but when he actually went to recall, he was in quite an emotional, anxious state, and therefore he was not able to recall. And again, the best route there, I would say, is to say this is supported by research by Godden and Badley. Or this is demonstrated by, you could use interference. Now, I would imagine that nobody's used this, but if you have, I'll just go through the mark scheme to show how you could explain this. You could argue here that two memories were conflicted or confused and became confused with each other. So what you could say has actually happened here is there is some kind of interference where an older memory has perhaps been disrupted by a newer memory, whichever he learnt first, French or Spanish. Now the issue here is we obviously don't know which order in which he's learnt these. So here we couldn't say whether it's definitely proactive or retroactive, but we could say it's an example of interference, and you could say it's possibly proactive or retroactive. And that's probably because he's learnt French and Spanish. They're similar in the sense that it's not English. So he's got some kind of interference between the two. So you could have used that as well, although I doubt that any of you would have used that, I'm being honest. The next one, the evaluation, I would imagine that most of you would use research supporting to evaluate this. So remember, you can say here, one strength of this is that it's supported by research. For example, Godden and Badley did this, found this, and this supports because. And that's probably the easiest way to access the marks there. And again, about here it says evaluation is relevant, well explained, and well focused on that explanation. And that's why I would imagine, and one of the things that I want you to do and get used to with AQA is reading ahead with questions. If you've got part A and part B, part C, D, etc., please read ahead, because you want to select information that will allow you to answer all the questions ahead. So if you've chosen interference theory here, you might find that harder to evaluate for this, and I probably would. So the best way to evaluate there is probably through research. And again, you could say, however, a weakness of this is that this was carried out using divers, and this doesn't tell us anything about students or anything about non-divers and so on. So it's actually quite easy to evaluate. Just because it isn't necessarily on the mark scheme, that remember that it's use of evidence, so the evaluation of the evidence, so we would accept any evaluation points there. So hopefully you're okay with that. Again, any queries, please come back to me. If you want to know how to get into the top band, it is detail, and you must have used some specialist terminology. If you've just said the diver study, can I just say that's fine as well? Okay, now I just put this in there because I wanted you to get an idea of how to answer this. But remember, and it is my fault for doing this, you wouldn't get 12 marks. This would potentially be a 16-mark question. So we've got discuss 2 explanations for forgetting, refer to Martin's experiences in your answer, and then we've got this stem here. It is quite similar to the previous question in the sense that it's looking at language, and it's probably looking at interference again. So this time we've got discuss, which is the command word, And discuss in a lot of ways, generally for you would mean outline and evaluate. But what it really means is that you're going to weigh up, you're going to talk about pros and cons of something. So if we go to the mark scheme, first of all, I'm not worried about the actual AO1, AO2 marks here because I never really mark like that. But what we're looking at are the bands here of where we would put things. And I always look at the top band. Knowledge of 2 explanations is accurate and detailed. So first of all, if you've not discussed 2, you cannot get in that band. So you can only get in band 2 if you've only discussed 1. But if you're struggling, just discuss 1. And you know that you're only going for partial performance. You know that you're only going to get a maximum of half marks, but that's okay, rather than not answering anything at all. So where are the marks coming from here? They're coming from 3 areas. Have you described it? Have you linked it? And have you evaluated it? So what I would do now is with 3 colours underline explanation number 1, where it is, in another colour where you've linked it to Martin's experience, and another colour your evaluation of that explanation. The next thing that I want to say here that you might not be aware of is that those 2 explanations can be both 2 types of interference or 2 types of retrieval failure. So you don't have to say one explanation is interference, another explanation is retrieval failure. You could do, but you're actually making it a lot harder work for yourself there. What you could do is say one explanation is proactive interference, another explanation is retroactive interference. So you could do that. I'm sorry, the noise you can hear is my dog walking around the room. I apologise for that. So again, application, French and Spanish are similar, and therefore interference is more likely. When you're learning a second language, interference is always going to be more likely because it's not our first language. So recalling the French word for chair is proactive interference. So you could give some examples there. Martin's mum gives him cues, the first letter, which can then be used for him to access the material he's failed to retrieve. Excuse me. Remember, for that, the explanations that you're going to use don't have to be separate interference, retrieval failure. You could actually use 2 explanations of interference within that, or 2 explanations of retrieval failure or absence of cues. And again, when you come to evaluate it, the best way to evaluate it, I would say, would be to use evidence. So although it says here use of evidence to support, so this is supported by Godden and Badley, this is supported by McGock and McGullen, whoever you're going to use to support it. So it does say credit any other relevant information, but you could basically link it to memory theory. If you could try to link it to any of the theories of memory, you could do, but I would say the easiest way there to access that would be through research evidence. This is quite an easy question. 6 marks. Describe interference as an explanation for forgetting. It's a complete AO1 question, so you don't have to refer to any research there at all, but you could do if you wanted to. So if we just have a look here at the content, and this is all about the detail. Interference is where information becomes confused. So you'd explain what interference is. So you might want to talk about some different examples of what interference might be. So here you will talk about, and ideally to get 6 marks, you've mentioned both proactive and retroactive interference, and explained what they are. And the key thing there, I think, for accessing the full marks is whether you've just talked about any terminology. This is quite a short question, and as you can see, the mark scheme's in blue, so this isn't a complete mark scheme yet. In the context of explanations of forgetting, what is meant by interference? And the reason it says that there is because, remember, we have got a bit of interference when we're looking at things like the multi-storm model. Because interference can occur, which can cause memories to decay. So if we have a look here at the mark scheme, question 5, 2 marks for the knowledge of interference as an explanation. So, for example, Interference is likely to occur when memories are similar, something like that. For example, when previously stored information disrupts the recall of newly stored information, or vice versa. You don't have to name the actual types, but that would be one route to getting that. B. Choose one study which the effects of interference were investigated. Briefly outline what the participants had to do in the study. Now, this is a question before, again, it was examined, and I don't think you'd actually get a question that is worded like that anymore, but we'll go through it anyway. I think you're more likely to get outline one study in which the effects of interference were investigated, briefly outline what the participants did and what we found. That's more likely to be the question now, and 4 marks as well. But again, the study that I would imagine you would use would be the rugby players study, Badley and Hitch, 1977, injury and the number of teams played. Again, very briefly what they had to do. There are other pieces of research, you can use any. It doesn't necessarily have to name who the researchers are. Briefly discuss one limitation of interference as an explanation of forgetting. Again, you could talk about research there, and that's probably the best way of looking at that. So, for example, many of the studies which the theories are based on are lab-based, and this is a problem because it doesn't tell us anything about real life. So if we were going to talk about, for example, Gordon and Badley's study of the rugby players, we could say that one problem with that was the lack of control. For example, because it was a field experiment, we weren't fully able to control it. We weren't fully able to track what happened to all those rugby players over the course of the research. So in that case, we wouldn't be answering it exactly like this, because this example here is talking about lab-based research. Okay, so I've finished the session on this. Again, any queries on the forgetting questions, please contact me and I'll happily go through them.